So New York State has been in the political news a lot over the past few weeks with the Trump conviction and the really close polls we're getting out of the Empire State, which honestly bring me, of course, to the topic of this video as to whether or not the state of New York is actually shifting away from Democrats. Now, I say away from Democrats and not towards Republicans because the overall percentage that Biden is getting in these polls is incredibly low to where he has been and previous Democrats have been over the past few decades. New York, when it comes to federal elections, is always a layup for the Democrats. And in fact, as we're going to talk about a little later, Republicans actually have the longest losing streak in statewide elections anywhere in the country in the state of New York. No Republican has been elected statewide here since 2002. Again, that's the longest streak of any state in the entire country. Even long Democratic states like Massachusetts, Vermont, Minnesota have all elected Republicans since 2002. So that really goes to show you how interesting it is that these polls are getting so close. And, Donald Trump's share of the polling average is about 40%, which is about a 3-point improvement over his 2020 vote total. So we're going to get to New York and the polls here and where it's likely to end up in 2024 in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. Now, this is sort of a follow-up video to a video I did about a month ago where we talked about a poll that had Joe Biden only winning in the state of New York by 8 points. Now the RCP average has Joe Biden up by only 8 percentage points. And again, this polling average has Joe Biden at 47.5 to Donald Trump's 39.5. Again, there's no reason why a Democrat should be under 50% in the state of New York. New York hasn't voted for a Republican for president since 1984 in Ronald Reagan's 49-state landslide. So that goes to show you just how Democratic New York is historically. Now, if we take a look at more polls, and again, RCP really only has 2 in this average, so this isn't really helpful. The latest poll we have has Donald Trump down by just 10 points in an Emerson College poll of registered voters. Siena College, which is fairly accurate in the state of New York, has Joe Biden up by just 9 points. Again, very concerning if you're Joe Biden. We have a Democratic internal that has Joe Biden up comfortably, 56-37. That's kind of closer to what you'd expect a typical Democratic margin in New York to be. And then we have more Siena College polls that basically have Joe Biden only up by around 10 points. And this goes all the way back to August of 2023. So a little bit concerning if you're a Democrat. Obviously, when you add third-party candidates into the mix, the situation gets a bit worse for Joe Biden. His overall vote percentage gets dragged down into the low 40s. Donald Trump into the low 30s, which puts him within, about 10 points or so. And then you have independents like John F. Kennedy Jr. getting 13%, Cornel West 6%, so on and so forth. Now, I think third-party candidates are more often than not overstated in polls. We've seen this in many elections. Even back in 2016, you had polls where Gary Johnson had about 10% of the vote, was in double digits in certain states, and that never happened. The only third-party candidate to get double digits in 2016, I believe, was Evan McMullin in the state of Utah. So third-party candidates are overstated, but again, Joe Biden, in polls being under 50% is a little bit concerning. Now, I will say most of these polls are Siena College polls, so it's the same polling firm, so that could be part of the reason. Perhaps they're oversampling Republican support. But again, I think this is indicative of the fact that Joe Biden is unpopular across the board. And even in deep blue states like New York, he's significantly underwater. I think he's underwater by almost 10 points now. I think one of the reasons why so many people think New York is going to be competitive this time around is because of how close it was back in 2022. Kathy Hochul beat Lee Zeldin by just around 6.5 points. And a state like New York had no business being this close. And this was a direct result of Democrats neglecting the state and taking their built-in advantage for granted. Now, Kathy Hochul still won at the end of the day, but this was much, much closer than it should have been in a state as blue as New York. Again, this is a state that voted for Joe Biden by 23 points back in 2020 and voted for Hillary Clinton by 21. I'll also note in the last gubernatorial race in New York, Andrew Cuomo defeated his Republican challenger by 23 points, getting almost 60% of the vote. Now, what's interesting about this map as opposed to the 2022 map is that you'll notice that upstate New York is actually redder. There's counties that Hochul won, Columbia, for example, that Mark Molinaro, the Republican nominee, actually won in 2018, which was a blue wave year. Andrew Cuomo was uniquely unpopular in upstate New York, and there's a number of reasons for that. The SAFE Act is part of it. The fact that upstate New York is often neglected by downstate, and, this broader feeling that upstate New York is different than the rest of the state. Upstate New York is a lot more like a Rust Belt state like Pennsylvania than it is the New York City metro area. Long Island, New York City, very different than upstate New York. Upstate New York is rural, a lot of small towns, and even the cities in upstate New York are fairly small. Now, something also noteworthy that I pointed out in the last video about New York is that when you look at the margins in these populated upstate counties, Onondaga County, for example, Kathy Hochul winning by 8 points. Monroe County, 8 points for Kathy Hochul, 6 points in Erie County. All of these counties were closer in 2018. Again, a blue wave year. You look at Erie County, for example, a 7-point margin for Hochul. Monroe County, Andrew Cuomo only getting 51% of the vote. Onondaga County is about 6 points. Now, the reason I bring that up again is because most of New York's population, obviously, is focused in the New York City metro area. So even though upstate New York was significantly redder than it was in 2022, at least certain areas, I should specify. The Hudson Valley, for instance, was redder. Some of the upstate cities were redder, but some of these more rural counties were redder in 2022. But I point that out because most of the population is here, and when Republicans do well downstate, that's where you get a result like this, where Lee Zeldin is getting almost 47% of the vote in one of America's bluest states. And, you look at Long Island, for example, Suffolk County, which in 2020 was the most populous county in the country for Donald Trump to win. He won it by, I think, around 200 votes. Lee Zeldin netted almost 100,000 votes here in 2022, winning the county by 16 points. Nassau County, another county with over 1 million people, a populous suburban New York county, Lee Zeldin wins by 10 points. These are both counties where Joe Biden did significantly better. Nassau County was nearly a 10-point margin for Joe Biden. Suffolk County was, again, around a 200-vote margin for Donald Trump. So massive, massive swings in downstate New York. You'd also look at Queens, Zeldin getting 37% of the vote, Donald Trump only getting 27%. Now, one of the reasons we saw a shift to the right, at least in terms of Donald Trump's overall vote percentage from 2016 to 2020, and this is something we also pointed out in the last video, was the shifts that we saw in New York City. For example, you saw Donald Trump bring down Hillary Clinton's margin in the Bronx, in Queens, in Brooklyn, every borough of the city except Manhattan. And if we look at the 2020 election, for example, you saw further shifts to the right, a 12-point shift to the right in the Bronx. Manhattan even saw a 2.4% shift. Queens saw an 8-point shift. Brooklyn saw a 7-point shift. Now, if we take a look at the precinct breakdown, there's very specific neighborhoods where Donald Trump overperformed, particularly among Asian and Hispanic voters. And this is something you've seen all across the country. And New York is really no different. Flushing, for example, in Queens is a mostly Asian neighborhood now. You saw some of these precincts shifting almost 30 points to the right. You saw shifts to the right in Jewish communities, even in some black neighborhoods, but mainly with Hispanic and Asian voters. And that's something that accelerated in 2022, which is one of the reasons why Queens became a little bit closer than normal. Brooklyn, Republicans almost broke 30% there. And even the Bronx, Republicans getting over 20%. Those are very good margins for a GOP candidate. Now, how this pertains to 2024, I think is a different scenario, because I think in 2024, you're going to have obviously much higher Democratic turnout on Long Island. One of the reasons why Zeldin did so well in the governor's race back in 2022 was because Republicans were super energized on issues of crime, cost of living, and really this sort of mentality that this was the Republicans' last stand in New York, because New York has been seeing a massive exodus of white middle-class voters moving down south to places like South Carolina, Florida, and this was really started, I think, in the 2000s, mainly because of the cost of living, but now you see it as more of a political migration, because these are conservative voters who really have no chance of winning statewide in their state, moving down to a state that has lower taxes and that shares their values. So, honestly, I think this election could have probably been different if this was the New York demographically of even just 10 years ago, back in 2014, where you had hundreds of thousands of more Republican voters in the state than you do today, because a lot of these people have left. So I think it's very possible that Zeldin could have won in an alternate reality where you didn't see this mass exodus of people leaving the state, mostly Republicans, and going down south and to other conservative places instead of staying in New York. I mean, Zeldin still did very well, obviously, for a Republican, getting nearly 47% of the vote. We really haven't seen a statewide race this close to New York since 2010, when you had the race for comptroller where the Democrat only beat the Republican challenger by over 4 points. So it's certainly been a while since New York has seen a competitive race, but obviously this was back in the day when you had Republicans controlling the state Senate and had much more of a voice in statewide politics than they do now. Democrats have a supermajority in both chambers. But as for New York's rightward shift, I certainly think that Donald Trump is probably going to overperform his 2020 percentage of the vote. I think he's going to get over 37%. I think a big milestone for him would be getting 40%. But if you have a continued shift among Hispanic and Asian voters, as we've seen in the city, and potentially you get boroughs like Queens, for example, Donald Trump gets 30-something% of the vote there, you certainly could see an environment where Donald Trump gets close to 40% of the vote in New York. And of course, that was the same percentage of the vote that George W. Bush got back in 2004, who was the last Republican to win the popular vote. So, for Republicans to do well, it's obviously a good sign that they're improving even in deep blue states. Even though Donald Trump has no chance of winning New York statewide, I think this is more indicative of the fact that Democrats are losing ground all over the country, even in states that are strongholds for them. So again, I will reiterate, this doesn't mean Donald Trump is going to win New York. He's not. But he certainly could improve on his overall 2020 vote margin. And I think that's certainly bad news for Democrats because, again, New York has important House elections going on in Long Island and sort of the downstate region, which we're going to talk about later this week because I want to start talking about the congressional elections because that's something I've really left out of the 2024 talk. And we'll certainly make videos on that going forward. But as of right now, this is really a sign of Joe Biden's weakness. We'll have to see if the polls continue to show that Joe Biden is losing ground here in the state of New York. But, as of right now, New York is still a safe Democratic state. I fully expect Joe Biden to win here fairly comfortably. But you could see Donald Trump get 38, 39, even 40% of the vote, which would be obviously a bad sign for Democrats and an improvement for Republicans because that could give them a foundation to work on come 2026 and beyond to actually win statewide offices again. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.